The righteousness of God is my identity because through my faith in Jesus, God has given unto me the very righteousness of Jesus. And so we looked at that in Romans 3 in terms of how the righteousness of God has been revealed. I want us to jump ahead into chapter 6. There's a whole lot of verses between where we read last time and where we're reading right now. And I'd love to cover all of them, and in time we will. But right now we're going to go to chapter 6. And one of the things he starts in chapter 6, the Apostle Paul does, is talking about, do we continue in sin, that grace may abound? And he says, absolutely not. So walking in sin and unrighteousness. And I'm just going to throw out there's a verse in 1 John that says, all unrighteousness is sin. So when we see this definition of sin, it's actually anything that deviates from the very nature and character of God. All right, so do I walk in unrighteousness, in sin? No, that's not my identity anymore. So that's the very beginning of chapter 6. And then he says how I've died to sin. But we're going to pick it up and read verses 3 and 4 of Romans 6. He says, or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Some really powerful concepts here. I want to remind you, read this personally. The Apostle Paul says we, but you can take that very personally. That means me. That means you. Read it personally. He says, as many of us, so me, who has been baptized into Christ's death. What does that mean? The same as it says elsewhere, that Christ died for me, and through his death I have been freed from sin. How? How does that work? Because the wages, as he also tells us in Romans, the wages of sin is death. My living in unrighteousness and sin, following after the way that seemed right to me, resulted in the forfeiture of the gift of life, in essence. I earned death. Jesus paid the price that I could never pay, which was death. I could not pay death, the debt that I had earned through sin, and yet live. So Jesus paid it. Elsewhere, the Apostle Paul writes that if Christ died for all, then all died. So that is the death, that is the payment. And that's what actually redemption is. We'll look at the redemption at some time. Just real brief, redemption is my brother paid for my debt. He paid my debt to free me from the one that I was indebted to. So in baptism, and he's making this picture. In baptism, what happens is the person, we're not going to get into a debate about immersion or sprinkling. But the picture in the scriptures is of being immersed in this water, buried in baptism. That's the wording used. But we don't stay under the water. In baptism, then, we rise from that water. The water represents the grave, being buried, just as Jesus was buried in the tomb in the earth. And on the third day, after 3 days and 3 nights, he rose again in newness of life. And that is the pattern that baptism pictures. I am raised, and that's what's pictured as me coming up out of that water. I am raised in newness of life. Sin's no longer my identity. Unrighteousness is not my identity, but the righteousness. So when I'm buried, I now have been washed and cleansed. I have been made brand new. The power of baptism is the emergence from that grave, that I have newness of life, and I do not walk in the same old that I used to walk in. I walk in newness of life. We're going to continue next week in at least another 1 or 2 verses, at least, in Romans. And we're going to talk about what this newness of life looks like. We're going to get there and I want you to read ahead, actually. I want you to read ahead. We're going to look at Romans 12, the first couple verses. It's really important how we're transformed by a new way of thinking. Elsewhere, the Apostle Paul tells us that we are new creation. We have put on a new life. My identity is not in the old. I put that off and I put on the new. And putting on the new is my identity in righteousness. I no longer identify with the sinful man that I was, but I identify with the new creation, the new life that I have, and the new creation that I am. And I don't accept and I don't embrace that which existed before. We all, just as baptism pictures, have died, we have been buried, and we have been resurrected into newness of life.